I have kept this story for far too long. Not because I'm afraid to tell it, but because every time someone hears it to the end, they start paying attention to the sounds their house makes in the dead of night, and they realize it always did, that there was always something there, but you came here, so you deserve to know. It was the winter of 1896. London breathed smoke and ambition in equal measure. The Victorian era was in its final years, and there was a strange tension in the air, like the kind that precedes a storm that takes its time arriving, but that everyone deep down already knows is coming. The British Empire dominated a third of the world, and at the heart of that empire, in every neighborhood, in every gaslit parlor, there were families who had built fortunes, some through labor, some through inheritance, and some through means they preferred not to discuss aloud. The Timberley family belonged to that third category. Cornelius Timberley was found dead on the morning of November 14, 1896. Officially, a sudden heart attack. A 55-year-old man of apparently sound health found in his bed with his hands crossed over his chest, and that was the detail that refused to leave Edmund Calloway's mind, because no man crosses his own hands over his chest in his sleep. That is something the living do for the dead, not something the dying do for themselves. I remember the first time I heard this case described to me. I was younger then. Not young, mind you, but younger. And the man who told me leaned across the table, lowered his voice to something just above a whisper, and said, "The hands weren't the strangest part." He paused, looked at his own hands. The strangest part was what the servants heard the night before. 3 members of the Timberley household staff, interviewed separately with no contact between them, reported the same thing. In the hours before dawn, sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, they heard a sound coming from inside the walls, not behind the walls, not above or below, inside them. A whisper, not words precisely, but not random sound either. Something rhythmic, something that felt, as one housemaid described it in her own handwriting. And I want you to understand that this woman had no reason to lie, no dramatic flair, nothing to gain. She described it as the sound of someone counting, slowly and patiently, as though they had all the time in the world. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the London of 1896, because this story cannot be felt properly without that context. Whitechapel was not simply a neighborhood, it was a wound in the body of the city that the city refused to acknowledge. Just 8 years prior, those same cobblestone streets had been the hunting ground of the most infamous, unidentified killer in modern history. The police were overstretched. The social fabric was fraying. And among the upper middle class, families like the Timberleys, there was a desperate, almost ferocious need to appear untouchable. Appearance was armor, reputation was survival. And that desperation, that is precisely what figures like the scribe fed upon. Edmund Calloway arrived at the Timberley mansion on November 16th, 2 days after Cornelius' death, 1 day after the funeral that, by all accounts, was attended by people who looked more relieved than bereaved. He was not a tall man, not an imposing one, but there was something about the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved through a room before his body did, that made people instinctively careful about what they said around him. He had been a Scotland Yard inspector once, a good one, the kind that made senior officers uncomfortable because he had an inconvenient habit of following evidence rather than instruction. That habit had cost him his position in 1891. It had never cost him his instincts. Iris Timberley received him in the drawing room. She was 22 years old, dressed in mourning black that somehow looked less like grief and more like a decision. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and Edmund noticed, with a discomfort he couldn't immediately name, that the position of her hands was not entirely unlike her father's. She spoke first. "I am glad you came, Mr. Calloway. I was afraid you might not. Your letter was persuasive," he said. "My letter," she replied, "contained only facts. If the facts were persuasive, that says more about the facts than about my writing." He sat down. She looked at him the way people look at someone they have already decided to trust, not with openness, but with the particular focused attention of someone who has already calculated the risk and accepted it. "My father was not the first," she said, "and if he don't act, he will not be the last." Now, I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. He was not the first. Iris Timberly knew, at 22 years old, sitting in a house that still smelled of her father's pipe tobacco, that the death she was mourning was not an isolated tragedy. It was an installment, part of a sequence that had begun before she was born. Think about what that does to a person, to grow up in a house where you understand, perhaps not consciously at first, but somewhere in the body, in the way the air changes when certain rooms are entered, that the prosperity around you has a price, that the silver on the table and the address on the door and the respect in people's eyes when they hear your family name came from something that does not bear examination. This is not a ghost story. I want to be precise about that. This is a story about what families bury, and about the patience of whatever waits for them to forget. Reginald Timberly, Cornelius's father, Iris's grandfather, had arrived in London in 1861 as a young man of 20 with nothing but a name that wasn't he entirely his own and a talent for making people trust him faster than was wise. By 1871, he owned 3 trading companies, a property portfolio in 2 boroughs, and a seat at tables where men of his original background were not typically invited to sit. The ascent was, by any rational measure, impossible, and in 1871, the same year his fortune consolidated with sudden and inexplicable completeness, a man appeared at his door. No appointment, no introduction through mutual acquaintance. Simply a card, handed to the butler by a figure the butler would later describe as someone who made him feel, inexplicably, that he should not look directly at the man's face for too long. The card had a single word on it. Not a name, not a title, a word: continuity. Reginald received him. The meeting lasted 4 hours. No servant was permitted in the study. When it ended, the man, who had come to be known, in the fragmented whispers of certain London circles, only as the escriba, left through the front door with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows they will be back. And they were right to know that, because from that day forward, the Timberly prosperity never faltered. Contracts materialized. Competitors stumbled at convenient moments. Doors opened that had no logical reason to open, but now and then, not often enough to constitute a pattern that anyone would dare name. A member of the family died. Always quietly, always naturally, always with that particular stillness that sits just slightly wrong, like a painting hung 1 degree off level. You sense it before you see it. The hands, always the hands. I.v., you spend a long time thinking about what compels a man like Reginald Timberly to accept an arrangement like that. And I don't think it was greed, not primarily. I think it was fear. Not fear of poverty, exactly. Fear of returning. Fear of being seen as what he had been before the money, before the address, before the name that wasn't he entirely his own. There is a particular terror that lives in people who have escaped a life they were ashamed of, the terror that the escape was never quite complete, that somewhere a door is still open behind them. The escriba walked through that door, and Reginald, instead of closing it, invited him to sit down. Edmund Calloway spent 3 days inside that house before he found the room, the locked room on the 3rd floor. The one Mrs. Aldgate, the governess, 67 years old, 40 years in service to this family, had told him, with a pleasantness that felt rehearsed, contained only storage. Old furniture, nothing of consequence. He found it on the 3rd night, when the house had settled into silence and Mrs. Aldgate had retired. The lock was a standard Victorian tumbler mechanism. Edmund had it open in 40 seconds. What he found inside was not furniture. The room contained records. Meticulous, obsessively organized records going back to 1871. Letters written in a hand that shifted, subtly, incrementally, between paragraphs, as though multiple people had written them, or as though one person had written them across so many years that the hand itself had changed and changed again. A ledger, names, dates, and beside each name, an amount, not in pounds, in something that had no clear monetary unit, just numbers, and next to some of the names, a small symbol, a mark. Edmund recognized 2 of the names immediately: Cornelius Timberly, marked, and below it, a name he had not expected to see, a name from his own past. I'll tell you something that took me a long time to accept. The most frightening thing in this story is not the whispers in the walls. It is not the hands. It is not even the escriba, whose face no two witnesses could agree upon, whose age appeared to shift depending on when and where you encountered him. The most frightening thing is this. Every person in this story made a choice. Reginald chose to open the door. Cornelius chose silence over confession. Mrs. Aldgate chose loyalty over conscience. And Iris is more complicated than she appears. She always was. Edmund confronted her on the fourth day. He placed the ledger on the table between them, opened to the page with the symbol, with the name he recognized. "You knew," he said. It was not a question. Iris looked at the ledger, then at Edmund. Her expression did not collapse. It clarified, the way a room clarifies when someone finally opens the curtains and you realize the furniture was never arranged the way you thought. "I knew," she said. And Mrs. Aldgate, a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "She has been their instrument for 11 years, Iris said. She does not think of it that way. She thinks of it as protecting the family. People are remarkably capable of believing that harm and protection are the same thing when they love something enough." Edmund sat down slowly. "The name in the ledger," he said. "My sister. Yes. She died in 1882. Yes. They told me it was fever." Iris folded her hands. "That gesture again. Mr. Calloway," she said quietly. "Why do you think I wrote to you specifically? Out of every investigator in London. You want to know something about grief? Real grief. The kind that has no clean shape, no beginning and no end. It doesn't announce itself. It lives in the places where your logic keeps returning, against your will, to the same unanswered question." Edmund Calloway had spent 14 years telling himself his sister died of fever. He had built his entire professional life around the idea that if you follow evidence far enough, you arrive at truth. He had followed evidence his entire career. He had never followed it home. Because some doors we choose not to open, not from cowardice, but because we understand, without naming it, that what's on the other side will require us to become someone different, and we are not yet ready to be that person. Iris had made him ready, whether he consented to it or not. Mrs. Aldgate was found the following morning, in her room, in her bed, hands crossed over her chest. The whisper had come for her too. The escriba did not leave loose ends. That was, in its own sepulchral way, the most coherent thing about him. Whatever arrangement he maintained with the families he controlled, his own exposure was non-negotiable. The moment Mrs. Aldgate became a liability, the moment Edmund's presence in that house transformed her from an asset into a risk, the decision was made with the same cold arithmetic that had governed every entry in that ledger. 40 years of loyalty, a mark beside her name, and silence. Edmund reported what he had found to a senior contact at Scotland Yard, a man he still trusted, one of the few. The case was reviewed for 11 days. It was closed as a series of natural deaths. Insufficient evidence. No identified perpetrator. He was not surprised. He was not even, precisely, angry. He was something quieter than anger. Something that settles in after a long time of expecting the world to be more honest than it is. Iris Timberly left London on the morning of November 24th, 1896. No forwarding address. No farewell. She left behind her cipher diary, placed deliberately on Edmund's desk in the mansion, along with a single pressed flower that meant nothing he could identify, and everything he couldn't name. He never saw her again. 3 weeks after Edmund closed his file on the Timberly case, he returned to his office to find an envelope on his desk. No postage, no return address, delivered by a method that the building's sole porter, a reliable man of 20 years' service, claimed with complete conviction he had no knowledge of. Inside, one sheet of paper. The handwriting changed between paragraphs. He read it once. Then he set it down very carefully, the way you set down something you want to fairmantastier.com, but also want to keep holding. The final line read, "Mr. Calloway, your sister also signed." The Timberly mansion was sold in the spring of 1898. The buyer was a family by the name of Harwick, originally from Southwark, of modest background. Their fortune, by 1900, had consolidated with sudden and inexplicable completeness. I don't know what happened to the Harwick family. I know that I hope they were careful about the doors they opened. And I know, because this is the thing this story has never let me stop knowing, that the escriba was never identified. No name in any official record. No photograph. No arrest. Several partial descriptions. all conflicting, all sharing one detail that every witness mentioned independently of the others: the eyes. Described universally as the eyes of someone who has no particular interest in the present moment, as though they are always, quietly, thinking about later. The Timberleys are gone now. Their name dissolved into the city the way names do, into census records and parish registers, and the occasional footnote in a book about Victorian commerce that nobody reads anymore. But here is what I want you to carry with you. After all of this, the scribe was not a supernatural force. He was a system, a patient, methodical exploitation of the one vulnerability that crosses every class, every era, every family that has ever existed: the desperate need to protect what you have built at any cost from anyone who might take it away. That vulnerability did not die in 1896. It is not Victorian. It is not historical. It is the oldest thing in the room. And the lesson the Timberley case leaves us, the lesson that Reginald refused to learn, that Cornelius buried under silence and drink, that even Iris could only partially escape, is this: the secrets we refuse to face do not disappear. They wait, they organize, they develop patience, and eventually, in one form or another, they whisper. If this story unsettled you, good. It should. The most important histories are the ones that disturb our comfort, not the ones that confirm it. If you believe that the past has something genuine to teach us about the present, then stay. Subscribe so that the next story finds you before the silence does. Leave a comment with the word "continued" if you made it to the end. I read every single one. And share this with someone who thinks history is just dates and names. History is never just dates and names. It is always, underneath everything, about what people chose to keep hidden and what happened when they did.